let's start at the beginning, and I want to say personally, just thank you for doing this. The last time I saw you, I believe, was 2015 in San Francisco. And correct. At that time, I believe you were giving a presentation to the World Affairs Council about your life and about what you had endured since your 2014 vote against the invasion of Crimea. For people in America who don't yet know much or anything about your life, I'd love to give them an opportunity to learn very quickly a little bit about who you are and what your history is in Russia, and specifically in Russian politics more generally.
Sure. I'm originally a technology entrepreneur. I started pretty early. When I was 14. I had two my startups in IT in the beginning of 90s, and so made two successful exits from them. And then the business of the second one was acquired by Schlumberger, a company which is very well known in Texas, where I'm speaking from. And I became director for business development in CIS countries, but my job was to pick up new technologies and then scout them worldwide. So I got a lot of international experience and expertise at that time. And then I joined UCAS Oil Company, because we made a strategic alliance between Schlumberger and UCAS, and which made UCAS the largest and the most successful Russian oil company. And I was vice president for technologies there, working with Mikhail Khodorkovsky. In 2003, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was sent to jail by Vladimir Putin for absolutely fraudulent and illegal accusations that were brought against him. And I was lucky enough to decide to go into politics half a year before Khodorkovsky was imprisoned, and that was probably the only reason why I stayed free and not behind bars, because all my friends went there. And then it was a good 15 years of doing politics for me. I never could have guessed so, because I always was thinking about myself again as an entrepreneur. So politics was more like social entrepreneurship for myself. And at the end of the day, in 2014, as you correctly said, I voted against the annexation of Crimea. I happened to be the only person to do this. I had several votes where I was the lone vote against this and that before. I started firstly when I was the only person to vote against so-called Duma Yakovlev law, which prohibited adoption of Russian orphans by Americans. Then I was the only person who stood against so-called gay propaganda law against LGBT community. And then it was Crimea, and like that one was considered by Kremlin as enough is enough. And they picked up the moment when I was on a business trip in July 2014, and just simply restricted me from coming back to Russia, so that I could not cross the border back to my own country. After that, I still for 2 years, I was member of parliament in absentia. In general, I was elected into the parliament in 2007, representing Siberia, in particular Novosibirsk, our capital of innovations, capital of Siberia. And since 2014 and up to 2016, when my term ended, I was basically member of parliament in absentia, voting remotely. I smuggled my voting card into the country, and my friend Dmitry Gudkov was pressing buttons for me. So that was how it was working. And in 2016, I moved to Ukraine. In Ukraine, I basically returned to the business career. I was what is called a serial SPAC entrepreneur. I was creating SPACs. These days, they are probably one of the most fashionable tools on the stock market. in the US. By the time we have started them, nobody yet know about this mechanism, but it was very useful to raise money for Ukrainian industry, and in particular Ukrainian energy and natural resources. And recently we were working on numerous projects in so-called battery materials, so the materials which are needed for the new economy, like lithium, beryllium, and other stuff like that. So that's more or less what I was doing when the war started.
Yeah, I knew that after you had spent time in the U.S. that you had gone back to the Ukraine, and I think I also knew that you lived in Kyiv. I want to talk about this year because I know you've done plenty of interviews since the war has started, and I'm wondering from your perspective if this is a situation that you foresaw. Was this something in your mind that you thought was an inevitability? I know you know Vladimir Putin personally. You are one of his most public foes. Is this a scenario that you, prior to February of 2022, thought was likely to occur, or was this something that you still thought was very unlikely to happen?
Frankly speaking, I thought that you guys, Americans, and Vladimir Putin from his side are both bluffing and playing political games one with another. And I never believed that this war can actually erupt in such a tremendous magnitude. So the war was ongoing in Ukraine from 2014, no doubt of that. And the aggression happened with the annexation of Crimea, and then it continued with fighting in Donbass. But it was all done, proxies, cautiously, it's not us, Malaysian Boeing was shot. No, it's not us, the deniability of everything. So I thought that Putin, being a very reasonable person, and I know that he is a reasonable person, he is not a crazy guy, that for him it would be obvious that this invasion would be extremely risky and at the end of the day outright dangerous for himself. So I was absolutely sure that he would not dare. But I was mistaken. I think that the reason for this is that probably he was making his decisions based on very inaccurate analytics and very bad intel that he was getting from his cronies, from his inner circle, which all try to be nice to their leader and to tell him what he wants to hear. So they were telling him that Ukraine is weak, that the president is extremely unpopular, a little bit of push, and the whole system would collapse. And also he was reading Western analytics, where also people were saying that Kyiv would fall at maximum within 6 days. From the beginning of the invasion. So he was probably thinking that, okay, so a small victorious war never hurt any politician. And probably that was his calculus. But he was gravely mistaken, and Ukrainians are fighting back, and they're actually winning this war. And right now, I think that for Vladimir Putin, the consequences would be very tough.
Yeah. You said earlier, just in that statement, that Vladimir Putin is a reasonable man. And I know that you know him quite well in a way that very few people in this world do know him. For people in the West, for people in America who are just getting caught up and brushing up on Russian history and near-term Russian history, how do you explain who this man is? You know him. When people ask you who Vladimir Putin is, how do you describe him?
Well, it's pretty easy to describe him with one word. He's a mobster. He's literally a mobster. He's a mafia-type personality who cares a lot about his personal power, about his personal position, about respect, and who values primarily loyalty in his people. He tries to link every single person who works for him within a vicious circle of crimes and corruption and different things that they would never have done by themselves, but that guarantee them their position within the system. And I saw this many times in Russian chain of command and vertical of power, that if there is no criminal offense against you, if there is no compromat against yourself, you would never be able to get into any decent position. You would never be allowed to become a mayor, to become a high-ranking bureaucrat, to become a governor or a minister. You have to steal to become Putin's official. That's his principle.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about your experience when the invasion occurred. As you just said earlier, this was not something that you thought was likely to happen, that it was mostly political posturing, if I'm understanding you correctly, between the Russians and the West and the Americans. What do you remember from that day of the invasion and your own mentality in realizing that you had been mistaken? Where were you? What do you recall about, those 6, 12, 24 hours?
The day before, I was in Dubai, and I was meeting with my partners, and we had certain business negotiations there, and everybody was telling me, Western media is full of predictions that the war would erupt every given moment. Don't go back to Ukraine. And I said, no, guys, that's that's not who I am. I should go there, especially if the war would erupt. I need to be there. I need to be with my new country. I need to be at home. I need to fight, and I need to defeat Putin, because that's my goal. And I caught the last plane on the 23rd, and I landed in Kyiv like 1 a.m. or something like this. And as we know, that 4 a.m. or 4:30 a.m. the bombings have started. But I live in a very quiet neighborhood of Kyiv, so they were not heard in my house. So I woke up normally in the morning, and was looking at my phone, seeing that looks like the war has started. So I dressed up, jumped the car, and moved to the nearest military recruiting post. There were two main locations on two sides of Dnipro River, which were specifically assigned for people who wants to join so-called territorial defense. That's like Ukrainian militia, so volunteers who are joining military to fight the aggression. I would be very frank that I also was under impression that, okay, so if the war has started, then the Russian soldiers would be pretty soon in Kyiv. I was not thinking that it's about 6 days or something. I was thinking that it would be really soon, because Kyiv is not that far from the northern border of Ukraine. That's why for me it was very important to get the weapons and prepare to fight. And so I volunteered, and by the evening of the same day, I was already in a certain regiment with certain assignments and preparing to fight. And I in the first night I wouldn't say that I was scared, but we were thinking that we may die that night.
Yeah. I know that we were emailing during that time, and that was my first thought as well. I have to say, as a Westerner and as an American just following this online, I think it's nearly universal, the impressiveness of the way that the Ukrainians, from the perception that I'm seeing this from, have been able to fight back and endure. And I know you are in the inner circles of Ukrainian political leadership. I'd love to get your thoughts on, everyone in the world now knows who Zelensky is, and you've been walking in those inner orbits for quite some time. Who is he, and what was your assessment of the state of the political environment in Ukraine prior to the war?
Well, firstly, what I want to say that Zelensky is simply a nice guy. He is. That's what he is. That's his main characteristic. He's very likable, and he's sincere. That's what is very rare among politicians in general, because he's not a politician. No. And all his personal drawbacks, they are being the continuation of his strengths. He is not a professional. He is not a professional politician. He never had any experience in the government and in public administration. And that's why, obviously, he was doing a lot of mistakes in the time of peace. And however high his popular support was at the time when he was elected, his approvals were slipping more and more. And I think that was one of the reasons why Putin was so much mistaken, because obviously he also saw the popular polls, and he was seeing that, Zelensky is currently supported, by around 40% Ukrainians, even maybe 37%. That's not that high, so it's very easy to kick him a little bit. And also he's not a military guy. He would not fight. He's an actor, and also he is Jewish, and many people of that culture, they like to preserve lives, so that he would not participate in the bloodshed, that he would just resign, and then the Americans, that they would evacuate him, and if the leader is out, then all others would immediately resign. But we know that Zelensky behaved totally differently, and again, if Putin would read a little bit about his psychological profile, he would understand that all his drawbacks in the time of war would immediately become his strengths. That the guy is stubborn, the guy is very committed, the guy has principles, and the guy knows about his place in history. He is a very dedicated person. So actually for Zelensky now, it's the moment of truth, which he's turning into the moment of triumph, because he right now is in his character. Even if we talk about Zelensky as an actor, then right now is his prime role in his life, and he is doing his job greatly.
Yeah, you said earlier that you could sum up Vladimir Putin in one word, and that word was mobster. It does seem like Western people are getting more familiar with his argument for war to the Russian people. And I know you've spent a lot of your career in the information space, and it sounds like you are still involved in media. For people who are unfamiliar with Putin's argument to his own people, what did he say? What do you disagree with about what he said to the Russian people? And if any, what lies are still being told within Russia about the circumstances, the pretext for war itself?
Putin is so great in propaganda because usually he speaks 80% of truth and 20% of outrageous lies, but they twist the truth in his personal benefit. What he's selling to Russians, he's playing on a very important national character, part of national character of Russians, which is very similar, by the way, to the national character of Americans. In general, I think that Russians are way closer psychologically to Americans than they are to Europeans. And I can give you a lot of examples of that. Russians fundamentally dislike and don't trust the government. They are very individualistic to the country, what many people believe. They're extremely individualistic. And they like campaigns within the society. It's very easy to ignite them. And most of all, that they have a mission. For America, the mission is to spread the torch of democracy in the world. Even when people are against this, you're still putting this torch on their territory. The same thing is about Russians. Russians also like to be liberators. They also like to carry this torch of freedom to others. And that's what Putin was telling them. That he was telling them, you see, that's our brotherly nation of Ukraine. And they are our brothers. There's nobody is more close relatives than Russians and Ukrainians. And you see, they suffer, they live poorly. And why is that? It's because bloody Americans, bloody Europeans, all other bastards, IMF, World Bank, they are sucking all the blood from our brothers and sisters. We need to liberate them. They don't understand. They've been zombified by Western propaganda. And I am telling you the truth, guys. We need, even if it's against our immediate interest, if it makes us suffer economically, but no problem. We will survive, but we will liberate our brother Ukrainians. And that's exactly what Russians thinking they are doing right now, because it's extremely pleasant for them, to feel themselves as being the liberators, and especially in all the magnitude of social frustration that exists in the modern days Russia, because Putin actually stripped Russians of all the means to change the power, to decide about their future. They are just following certain tracks which they have no power of. And here they suddenly become important. And that's why he reminds them about the glory of Russian people during World War II, how we liberated all of Europe against fascists. And so we need to repeat it, in a small scale, only for Ukraine. But they repeat that great deed that our grandparents have done. And obviously, that inspires a lot of people. And when they're coming to Ukraine, they see something totally different. They do not recognize where are all those fascists, where are all those Nazis, and that's why the morale of Russian army is falling significantly, because they, it's a cognitive dissonance, in their eyes. And now that they start to think, okay, maybe then all of Ukrainians are neo-Nazis. Maybe like good Ukrainians, they somehow went away, and those who remain, because they are shooting at Russians. Literally every single person is shooting at Russians. It's you cannot imagine the degree of the resistance that they are seeing on Ukrainian soil, and they start to die, and they start to try to get revenge from their friends, from their comrades, which felt in Ukraine, which were killed in action. And that's where all those rapes are coming from, and tortures of the civilians, all those awful atrocities that are being committed in Ukraine, because people are totally disoriented. They do not understand what's going on, what's happening.
Yeah. It seems to me that there are two things going on. There is the actual physical war, and then there is the information warfare. And I know you have spent a lot of time in that space. What is your assessment? And I should say for the listeners, we're talking on April 7th, 2022. What is your assessment currently of the cognitive dissonance or the information that has penetrated the Russian soldiers themselves? What's your take on their assessment of the situation?
There is a phrase of a great Russian writer that it's hard to fool me, but I like to be fooled myself. And that's exactly what is happening to Russians these days, because what I was telling you about the idea with which they are coming to Ukraine is the idea which is extremely appealing to every ordinary Russian. That, finally I have meaning in my life because I'm doing something good. I am liberating Ukrainians from that evil that they're suffering from. And I'm a great guy. I'm a good person. Yes, nobody called me to do this, but that's our leader who knows better. He understands what should be done. And yes, I'm ready to spill my blood, but help Ukrainians. And that's why propaganda in Russia is so efficient, because he's telling Russians things that they really like to hear, that makes them feel great. Not because they're imperialists. There is a certain part of population which is imperialist, but it's a tiny minority. Majority is not imperialist. They don't care. But to like themselves, to feel themselves great because they're doing something good, that's what propaganda is playing with. And then when the reality and this picture comes to a conflict, they pretend to ignore the reality, because if you would agree that you are not a good guy, that you are actually evil person, that you are actually fascist, that it's not you are repeating the fight against fascism, it's Ukrainians who are actually repeating the fight against fascism. And then now it's a mental roadblock in your head. You can do nothing about it, because then what should I do? Commit suicide? Or should I take a machine gun and start fighting against Putin? But he's so strong. And so it's not only a question of propaganda and disinformation. It's also a question of what people like to admit and what they're not ready to admit. To give you an example, and sorry for such a long answer, but I think it is important.
Yeah.
We made a story on our media channel, which now we created to broadcast for Russians working from Ukraine. We made an interview with a lady from California, a Russian lady. She lives in California for like 20 years already, full time. She does not listen to Russian TV channels. She reads, obviously, social media, but she's not affected by Putin's propaganda. That's what she watches CNN. No, she votes Trump, so she probably watches Fox News. Yes, but nevertheless, she watches American media and not Russian media. And she does not believe that Russia is doing all those things in Ukraine, despite everything that she sees in her life on her TV screen. And when we were asking her, why, don't you, believe like what everybody, literally everybody is saying? She said, no, you should understand. We Russians, we are not like that. We Russians, we cannot be fascist, period. So if somebody is telling me that we are fascists, that means that he is lying, because simply it's not possible.
Yeah. And how long do you think that narrative can hold? And maybe it's indefinitely, but how do you think about that generally for the Russian people?
It's not indefinite. It's the same thing with Nazi Germany. When you are victorious, you can ignore facts, or when you think you are victorious, right? Then you can ignore facts. But when you are losing, you start asking questions. Why are we losing? So as soon as Russians will start to recognize that they are losing, and that picture is being made from different pieces, So it's it's the dead bodies which are coming back home. It's some confessions that the generals are making, even like they don't want to admit that they are not victorious, but in their speeches, you can actually understand something. Then obviously that's the effect of sanctions, which are taking their toll as well on the life of ordinary Russians. So altogether, that's mounting up, but it requires time. And I think that a couple more months, I think it would last. My rough estimate is just that altogether it should be like half a year from the very beginning to the moment when Russians will start to understand something. So my forecast is that August is probably would be the time when Russians will start asking questions for Vladimir Putin. That's why he's in a hurry. He wanted this to be a blitzkrieg from the very beginning. It already didn't work. Right now, I think that he would try to claim certain victory by May 9th, which is for Russians is a very symbolic and very important day. It's the main national holiday, the Victory Day, what everybody celebrates on May 8th. In Russia, we celebrate it on May 9th. And I think that Vladimir Putin wants to claim victory at that very day.
Yeah. You said earlier in the conversation that when you took the flight in from, I think it was Dubai, and the war started the following day, you thought it was very likely that the Russians would march on Kyiv very quickly. That has not happened. What do you make of that in your assessment militarily of what has happened in that region of the war specifically? How do you explain the success of the Ukrainians and the failure of the Russians in Kyiv specifically?
Firstly, obviously, there was a tactical defeat for Russian forces in the very first day, because I think that the immediate plan was to capture an air base, which is right next to Kyiv, and then deploy airborne rangers there, the most capable military groups in the Russian army, so that they would march on Kyiv and capture it. But they faced a lot of resistance at that base. It was in Gostomel. It's like 30 kilometers to the west from Kyiv. They faced a lot of resistance from National Guard. The helicopters, which were supposed to cover the deployed troops from the air, they were forced to fly away. They abandoned those who were on the ground already, and then all of them were just physically exterminated. And obviously, that was a very bitter defeat and the result of extremely bad planning. of the operation. But that was a tactical thing that allowed Kyiv to stand during the very first night. And my peer regiment, the one I was in, we were in Kyiv, and the second one actually was part of that battle. But strategically, obviously, the defeat is coming from the fact that Ukrainians have managed to mobilize a lot of ordinary citizens. It's a huge rise in patriotic feelings within Ukrainians. I saw those queues to the recruiting posts. At first, there was simply not enough weapons. There was not enough vacancies even in the partisan forces and the guerrilla forces. They cannot accept everybody. So you have to sign your name, and then we'll call you later. You see, really, too many people. And obviously that was not expected by Kremlin, and that makes me extremely puzzled, because I think that Putin, that was one of the reasons why I was saying that he would not invade, because Putin has started his very first presidential term with the war in Chechnya, and he knows very well that it's impossible to claim victory over the nation which fights against you as one. And Putin, very smartly at that time, he managed to split Chechens. And he made an agreement with Kadyrov Sr., and now it's his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, which is running Chechnya. But that was the key to the victory. So he was fighting Chechens with the hand of Chechens. If he would have somebody within Ukraine who would be ready, to open doors for Russian army, that would be a very different. Thing. But now all of the people of Ukraine, they stood as one. Even those cities which were considered to be pro-Russian, like Kharkiv or the same Mariupol or Odessa, they all are now fighting against Russian army. Actually, there is such a sad joke that nobody has done more for the building of Ukrainian nation as Vladimir Putin. Bandera or whoever else, they are coming, so distant second. Nobody has done more for building of Ukrainian nation, but Vladimir Putin. He united everyone against him, and now I'm I'm smiling, but it's very sad smile, because that means hatred for generations to come, and that means that really, indeed, brotherly nations, they would be at very bad terms for many, many years.
Yeah. And you have been living in this world, and I would be curious for the audience to have you explain or detail what an average day is like for you. I mean, you appear to be, I don't know if you're in a bunker right now or where exactly you are. You said before we started recording that there are missiles flying overhead. What's an average day look like for you in your life and your comrades who you're fighting with?
Well, I cannot say many things, because some of them some of them are sensitive. No, but I have to come to I would say undisclosed location, because I'm on the hunt list, and right now Russian forces kicked out from Kyiv vicinity, but nevertheless, from time to time, different sabotage groups are being discovered, and that's why we have to make certain precautions. In the first 24 hours, as I said, I was within the outright military regiment, so I was within the military environment, so to say, and was sleeping there. Now, we are doing a certain media project, as you correctly said. I'm now connected to media, and that's a dedicated TV channel that we have created, which is working in Russian language from Ukraine, but speaking to Russians in Russia. We are using all the different types of media. We're using YouTube. We are using Telegram. We are using TikTok. We are using Contact. We're using Facebook. So we are like everywhere. So we're trying to use all the social tools and media to communicate with Russians. And firstly, obviously, to deliver them the truth about what's going on in Ukraine. And we are the only media which stayed like this, because Putin has closed everyone inside Russia. And obviously in Ukraine, nobody is talking to Russians. There are Russian media, Russian language media of Ukrainian origin, but they are speaking to Ukrainians in Russian, not speaking to Russians in Russian. So we are the only of its kind. And to my mind, it's pretty important. We don't have that huge audience right now. Our daily audience is between million and million and a half, but nevertheless, it's substantial. And we're glad that we managed to do this, and it is important, more important than outright military fighting, especially that there are no troops around Kyiv at this very moment.
Yeah, and this may be a repeat of some facts that you have already talked about during this conversation, but what is your primary message for the Russian people?
That the root of all the problems is Vladimir Putin and his clique. Probably that's the key message. Obviously, Ukrainians right now, they have very emotional reaction on what's going on. So many people killed, so many civilians, and they sometimes say all Russians are useless, that it's your guys' fault. Everybody shares the guilt. And to my mind, that we all share the responsibility, but not everyone who shares the guilt, because there were quite a lot of people, who stood against the war from the very beginning. They didn't do enough to remove Vladimir Putin from power, and that's why they do share the responsibility. Everyone with the Russian passport shares the responsibility, but they don't share the guilt. And that's that's two separate things. And we are trying to talk to these people, and we are trying to inspire them to get engaged in changing of power. That not to run away. I cannot blame anyone who decided to leave Russia, obviously, but that's not our way. And when we were talking about my bio, I never left Russia on my own. I was not allowed to return, so I physically couldn't do it. Otherwise, I would have never left Russia on my own. But right now, we need to convince as many people as possible to stay within the country and fight.
Yeah. You said earlier in the conversation, too, that you believe that Ukraine is winning the war. And I would want to ask you, what do you need? What is the message that you would send to the West, to America in general, about what is necessary in order to continue the momentum, the forward momentum, and the victory of Ukraine in the war?
obviously the most important thing for us is no-fly zone. No-fly zone is needed for two things. Firstly, to prevent losing more civilian lives, because what Russian army is doing, they cannot capture the cities, so they start to physically eliminate those cities. They are just shelling the residential areas. They are trying to provoke people of those cities to rebel against their leaders, to say, okay, we surrender, just please don't fight. And again, they are reaching the opposite result, but they are killing a lot of people. And they're doing it using missiles and bombers. So that's why no-fly zone is important for that. But also no-fly zone is important for counteroffensive, because right now Ukrainians are doing marvelously in resisting, in doing partisan war, in shooting in the backs of Russian soldiers, in destroying the fuel tanks, in using, again, thanks to the United States and to British, they're using javelins and NLAWs to destroy tanks. But to advance, you need to use your own tanks. And when you don't control the skies, you cannot do this because they're just being physically destroyed. So infantry is fine, but any of the heavy armored equipment which is needed to advance cannot be used because skies are occupied by Russian airplanes.
Yeah. I have to bring this up because I think it must be something that's on your mind. I think it is something that some Americans are also thinking about, which is, given that reality, which you just articulated, of Ukraine fighting back and in many ways winning the war as it is, the mobster in charge of the Russian military and the Russian people has a nuclear arsenal. And there is a non-0% chance that a mobster, if cornered, might use such a weapon. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk to you about how you think about that problem. You know, first, I guess, how do you think about the nuclear threat? And second, what do you think is, to avert a potential nuclear scenario, how do you see this unfolding in such a way that that outcome could be prevented in the first place?
Firstly, I want to say that Putin is doing his best to make the West believe that he is crazy and is capable of using the nuclear weapons. That he is fanatic, that he is that he doesn't care about nothing, you know, that he can use the nukes. That's his strategic objective. And unfortunately, you know, as we are discussing this, he is successful because you do believe that he can do it. I would say that, you know, I also think that the chance is not zero, but my mind is pretty minimal. And why I do think so is look at how he meets his own stuff. A very, very, very long table. You know, he's paranoid. He is afraid for his life. Would such a guy start a suicidal nuclear attack? Because he knows that if he starts a nuclear attack, then it would be a counter-strike on him. That's a guaranteed thing. So, no, I can never believe that the guy would commit a suicide. Secondly, there is one great game that Russians like to play, you know, in the way the propaganda works and the way the diplomacy works, is Mr. Putin likes to speak about asymmetrical measures. When he says, you Americans, you have, a very, very expensive weapons that you just recently announced, this and that. And we in Russia, we have something very cheap, asymmetrical, which we can apply, and all your efforts will be useless. And Putin, being a former KGB guy, he's extremely afraid of secret covert operations. He remembers how you guys have recovered Bin Laden, for example. Yeah. He believes that it was Americans who were standing behind the assassination of many world leaders. He remembers Noriega from Panama, which was kidnapped by American Marines. So that's the threat that is real for him, way more real than the nukes. So he does not believe that you guys would use nukes on him because, the cost of life in the West is way higher than the cost of life in the East. But that you guys would recover him from whatever bunker he's sitting, that he would believe.
Yeah. And from your vantage point, again, in having this conversation in early April of 2022, what is the best case outcome from your perspective, given the current circumstances, the current knowledge that you have? How do you foresee that best case scenario unfolding for Ukraine in general? What does that look like?
I think that Ukraine is already winning this war. And I think now it's the biggest question mark is when and what would be the price. And that's again why Ukraine needs Western assistance, is because it's paying very high price. And frankly, it's not fair because Putin is a threat for the rest of the world. It's a threat for all of Europe. And right now, the West is trying with money, buy Ukrainian blood to stop this fire. And, I don't think that's a fair approach, frankly speaking. Yeah. But then there is no other outcome but one. No dictator ever escaped the fate of his removal and usually death after they lost the war. And Putin would not be an exception. So I think that Putin is already a dead man. He maybe doesn't know it yet, but he is a dead man. When that would happen, most likely within a year from now. How that would happen, I don't know. That may happen through a palace coup, when his own inner circle or a little bit outer circle would say enough is enough and would assassinate him. Or it may be through a public revolt. I would definitely prefer the latter rather than the former. But at the end of the day, the end for Putin would be the same. So I think that we now have to think a lot about who would be next and what his policies would be and how Russia would look like. Because at the end of the day, as you correctly said, it's number one nuclear power in the world. It's in terms of nuclear capacity, it's larger than the United States. And if Russia would start to collapse, and the probability for this is extremely high right now, I wouldn't say that it's guaranteed, but it's a high probability. Yeah. Then we should think about the future and the global security.
Yeah. You said this earlier about what the zeitgeist is amongst Americans. And I know you've spent a lot of time in America. That's where we met. And I think you're right that we have a gung-ho attitude about at least historically, maybe not so much in the recent years, about our capacity to help the inevitable implementation of democracy across the world, and that all people across the world will willingly accept that form of government to live under. And I think we have been deeply humbled in our failure to do that in a couple of instances in my own lifetime. This is, I think, another concern in America because of our own history, that we think the elimination of a mobster from one of the great world powers will be inevitably better for the world, without really considering oftentimes what the second order consequences might be of an even worse leader. I'm sure this is something you have thought about. How do you think through what is the likely successor to Putin? If you are correct that he is already a dead man and he has maybe 12 months to live, or at least to be in power, what do you think are the possibilities or the probable outcome from his departure from power in Russia?
Well, the likely successor I am. But seriously speaking, it's very hard to predict because right now there is no recognized political force within the country which can inherit the power. I think that whoever Putin would pick up as his successor himself, if that would happen, which theoretically may happen, in the current situation would already not be stable because there is no positive strategy for such a person to get away from all the sanctions and the consequences of war. He needs to radically change the course and to damn Putin and totally cut all the ties with him, which obviously for the successor would be problematic. And if not doing so, the continuation of Putinism with the successor, then the successor would be inevitably weaker, and that means even more chaos and even less predictability. So that's why the scenario with the managed transit, to my mind, is currently unlikely. The variant with the palace coup is more likely, but right now there is no obvious person who can be the center of this coup. I think that the only possible scenario would be when, say, oligarchs recruiting, some people from the second layer around Putin, so that layer which has theoretical physical access to the body, but not the very inner circle. It's like paying money, and that can be very random, because who would take the bribe, who would be willing to accept cash, in exchange for a certain future. That's very unpredictable because that circle is quite large. So, and it's very hard to predict. In terms of popular revolt, Putin has eliminated all even theoretical possibilities for organized political force which is on the streets and not in jail or not in immigration. Obviously, such people as Navalny, for example, they cannot participate in this battle because he's in jail. His people are outside the country. People like Khodorkovsky outside the country, no network within Russia, they all are in jail. So these two theoretical potential leaders both basically cannot participate in whatever scenario of change of power. But the demand for such a political force and such leader or leaders is obviously growing. and this demand would be inevitably met with a supply. How that would happen, who knows? Who that would be, who knows? Again, Putin has done so many efforts to glorify these volunteers fighting in Donbass. So, and they are position-minded in terms of Putin himself, because they feel like they have been betrayed by Putin in 2014 and 2015. They also have pretty socialist, leftist economic views. They are very conservative politically. So they are, they are Russian imperialists. So they are not left by definition, but they combine imperialist, conservative political views with the leftist economical platform, and that makes them pretty popular inside the country. And they may jump into the front very unexpectedly, and they could become the leaders of the revolt. But maybe different. There can be genuine leftists or genuine nationalists. Nationalists in general very much supporting Ukraine, because their slogan was that we don't want Soviet Union to be restored. We want Russia for Russians and Ukraine for Ukrainians. So they created a kind of nationalist international with the Ukrainian freedom fighters and join forces with them. They can be also the driving force for the revolution. We see how the history goes.
Yeah, I would imagine, and I know we're beginning to wind the conversation down. There are just a couple things I want to go over with you before you go to bed. I'm sure you're absolutely exhausted. One is about your own future. You have been living in exile for many years, and if you're correct that Putin's days are numbers and there is likely to be a major shakeup in the Russian political system, how do you see your role potentially in that future system? I just as an American and knowing your biography, you seem to be one of the few public figures who will have, if this scenario is realized, come through this with his integrity intact. How do you, for yourself, think about your future in a potential future Russia?
My future is bright. But my exact position would be for Russian people to decide.
Fair enough. Just one other thing I want to go over with you. I know that in the last few weeks when we've been emailing, and if there had been time that elapsed between when we had communicated, I thought there was a reasonable chance that you were dead. And you have been fighting this battle against Putin for many years now. And I have to imagine that during that time, there must have been a time and a place or an evolution in yourself where you were comfortable giving your life for your own dissent. In some ways, I'm amazed that I'm even having this conversation with you, given your profile and given your own outspokenness and your relationship with the leadership in Russia. I'd love to hear you talk, if you can, about why you have decided to act in the way that you have. Why does it matter so much for you to be such a thorn in the side of these thugs? And am I correct in assuming that you have already decided that this is a cause worthy of your life if that's what happens?
You're absolutely right, obviously. Yeah. My answer for this is pretty simple. Do what you feel you need to do and let things happen. That's the principle I live. Obviously, I can select the particular path. And I had an important decision in my life back in 2002 when I decided to go into politics in the very first place. And that decision was very much driven by what was happening in Russia, firstly in 1998 when the country defaulted, and that instilled a lot of poverty and chaos on Russians. But then when Putin also was coming to power in the year 2000, when he made a huge attack on the freedom of speech, and at that time that also affected me directly, because I was planning to do one very interesting media project with Ted Turner, and he basically got stuck between Putin and the journalists of media station NTV. He volunteered to be the mediator, got screwed up by Putin, left Russia. Our project collapsed because of this. So that was like another push for me. And that time I made the decision that I should go into politics because I just need all this nonsense to be fixed. And after that, I was simply doing what I had to do. Just based on my principles, on my upbringing, on my views, I was just trying to do honestly what I need to do. I was always trying to be rational. I never tried to be emotional. I never tried to generate whatever like political hype. I always tried to be constructive, but principles are principles, and they led me to where I am now.
Yeah. Well, in closing, I just want to say, as an American, as just a human being, I have so much respect for yourself and your comrades who are fighting this fight. And I know I speak for hundreds of millions in the world in it just expressing a deep admiration for what you are doing. And for you specifically, this is such an honor and a privilege to be able to do this with you. And I hope you are correct. And I hope the potential future for Russia, the one that we've talked about today, it is realized, and that, maybe one day we can have a tall glass of vodka in Moscow together.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I think that yes, we do it in Kremlin, and we speak for all the free people in this world. And we really, I'm very sincere here in Ukraine. We really feel your support. We really would wish that all Western politicians would do the same as ordinary people in the West. But we do feel your support, and thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Ilya. It's amazing to see you, and obviously the best of luck. And I hope to talk to you again sometime soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you're finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show via the links below on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Your support helps to make these conversations possible.